Good evening, everyone. My name is Phil Magness. I am a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, all the way up in Massachusetts. It's very cold up there right now. We are covered in snow, so even though we've got a little bit of a cold front coming through here, this is a very welcome return to the South. So happy to be here tonight, and happy to be talking about an issue of great economic consequence that if you watch the television, you watch what the newspapers are saying, everyone is talking about economic inequality. The difference between the haves and the have-nots, or, as we often hear, the top 1% and the rest. Who's heard about inequality recently? Show of hands, yeah, a few. A lot of people talking about it in the presidential election in the United States, but also globally. And one of the things I do as an economist is I try to measure inequality. I work on international data sets, I work with tax records, and I try to do it historically, going back almost 100 years. That's about the earliest that we can get good inequality data, because it depends on the measurement of income, how much you are earning. And from the measurement of income, we can also get to the measurement of wealth. So the difference between your income and your wealth, just to use these terms, because I'm going to be bouncing between both of them. Income is what you earned in a given year, and then wealth is your net worth. It's everything that you accumulate over your life. Net worth is a lot harder to measure right now than income, because income, you report your taxes, you file papers on how much you earned in the last year. Your net worth includes your car, your house, stock markets, bonds, all sorts of securities that you may own. It could be hundreds of different things that are very hard to price. So income's a clear dollar amount, net worth, not so much. But both of these terms are used in the inequality literature to talk about how people relate to each other. And I want to run through just a few of the basic questions that people ask when we discuss inequality. Number one, was it a historical problem? And I answer yes to some degree. We have found that societies that moved into extreme inequality, and especially extreme inequality that was perceived as unfair. Think of the king living in a palace with everything, and everyone else with nothing. Those are moments of historical problems of inequality, because what normally happens when that emerges? People revolt against the king. So if we go back to the Middle Ages, we go back 300, 400 years ago, we have several incidents where kings had too much, and they got their heads chopped off. So that's extreme inequality. That's way, way back in time. We do see elements of that today, and sometimes in dictatorships. So a famous one that just died about a year ago, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Very notorious dictator that had ruled for about 30 years. He was finally deposed. But they found after he died, he had billions of dollars in his bank account that he had stolen over the years. He lived a lavish lifestyle in a country that's very poor. Everyone else was in abject poverty. They were starving. He was the dictator. He had everything. Ill-gotten means, that's a problematic type of inequality. Second question I'll ask you, is inequality a problem today? If you ask politicians, they'll all have some sort of an answer to that. And I'm not going to give you a clue of what my own answer is just yet, because I want to talk about the data. I want to say how we measure inequality and walk you through it. Third question, is inequality rising, or is it declining? And this is a complex one. And I'm going to say it's complex because we don't really know, and it varies from different country to country. Some places it's probably rising, some it's probably declining. The United States is one of the most studied because we have some of the best data, and the political system is really focused on this. So I'm going to try and give you the best evidence from the United States and how it relates to the rest of the world. And then fourth, what causes inequality? Some of the theories that are put forth are both good and bad things can cause inequality. Bad things we hear about maybe taxes are too low. That's at least one of the claims that's made. I'm going to challenge that claim. Some of the good things we hear about, if tech fortunes are expanding at a rapid rate, and people are introducing new technology, new items, new products that people want to purchase, often they get very rich very quickly. And the world is better off because of the products that they are offering, but they're also better off. The inventor is better off because he sees his income rising really, really quickly. And that will rise inequality. Another one that we're going to get into, immigration. It has profound effects on inequality. And then finally, what, if anything, can or should not be done about the existence of economic inequality? This is where all the policy debate is about today. I want to introduce to you a famous curve. This comes from the economists Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. They are two French economists. One's based at the University of California, Berkeley. The other is based in Paris. And they revolutionized the study of inequality by developing this chart based on the United States. They've studied it in other countries. They found similar things. What this shows is from 1913 to basically today, the concentration of income among the top 1%. And we see it starts out really high, it drops, and then it gets high again in their depiction. I'm going to challenge this chart. I think it has some errors in it, and I can show you some of the errors, but I want you to visualize that. Keep that in the back of your mind, because this same story, we often see it portrayed in the data in hundreds of countries around the world. And the idea here is there's high inequality in what we call the late Gilded Age. This is until about 1929. What happens in 1929? Everything crashes. Great Depression. Although you notice on this chart, 1929 is right here. Does inequality stay high in their depiction? Yeah, for at least another decade. And this is the oddity of their story. So in their narrative, they claim it's the Great Depression that causes the first change. But we really see it's taken place about a decade later, 1941 or thereabouts. What's going on then? World War II. So World War II is almost the unacknowledged version of the cause in this story. Then it levels out until about the mid-1980s. And according to their version, it rebounds. That's their depiction of the United States. They call this the U-curve, the U-curve theory. So the U is across the century, high inequality, low inequality, high inequality. And they ask the question, what causes these changes to occur? I think this is an interesting question. I'm skeptical of the causes that they give, and I'm even skeptical of the data, but I want to show it to you. They also attempt to map this out into wealth. So we've jumped from income to wealth, and notice it's more or less the same picture, at least according to their version of the data. Their causal claim is that inequality in the United States is inversely related to tax policy. And to attempt to prove this claim, they show the highest income tax rate on people that earn over $1 million in any year. And notice it looks a lot like an upside down version of the U. So in the middle of the century, very high income tax rates, and then on either end, low income tax rates. So they claim that that is what's causing inequality to go up and down. It's whether the government taxes more or less of high-end wealth. This brings up the policy responses. This is what's being discussed on TV right now, and including the election that happened yesterday in Iowa, although they don't quite have the results yet. So Elizabeth Warren is one of the prominent figures, Bernie Sanders. They have both embraced something called the wealth tax. We have Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has endorsed a return to high income tax rates. And this is the economist behind it. That's Thomas Piketty, one of the persons that I engage with and critique from time to time. He is saying that we need to adopt these types of taxes for non-fiscal reasons. if you think about your economics lessons, typical fiscal policy is based on paying for stuff through the government, raising enough revenue to pay for stuff through the government. They're saying we need to adopt taxation for a very different reason. This is not about the revenue, although they'd probably welcome more revenue. This is about penalizing wealth at the top because they think it has bad social products that come from it. But that's the gist of their story. They have a historical timeline that maps very closely on the Ucurve. It starts in 1900 in the Gilded Age, where they say that the wealthy are living on their rents. They call them rentiers. This is especially true of Europe, but they see it across the world. This is old moneyed fortunes have accumulated wealth, and they no longer need to work because they just earn rental income or they earn returns on their stocks. Piketty says that 3 major events occur that obliterate what is referred to as the capital stock, the yielder of rents. That's the 2 world wars and the Great Depression in particular. He focuses on the Depression. His data looks more like World War II is the emphasis. Question that comes out of this: wait, is war a good thing because it eliminates inequality? Probably not. Probably not. And he would not advocate that. So anyone that would say, let's go to war with the rest of the world to eliminate inequality is crazy. I think that's fair enough. But he does say some other things can be done. Progressive taxation can prevent capital from constituting, and as a result, inequality declines. He says there's a golden age from the 1950s through the 70s when high taxes result in a trough of the inequality U. I'm skeptical about that golden age because it's also a period when there are far more women that are participating in the workforce. If you know anything about the United States in particular, racial policy is really bad in that era. That's segregation, especially if you are African American. If you are black, you are kept out of the workforce. So that's not so golden of a golden age. But then he says inequality's back, precipitated by the tax cuts. Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, and he says other countries copy this. So that's his historical timeline. In the past few minutes, I've summarized 1,000 pages of a book for you. That this is the gist of his story. So you don't have to read it. You don't have to worry about a 1,000-page book unless you're really interested in this topic. But that's his historical narrative. And I want to give him a fair shake on this because I'm going to challenge some aspects of this. His prediction is that if we allow this trajectory to continue, in 80 years, we're going to be back at what existed prior to the Great Depression. So that could be a problem, according to this version. Now, I showed you the U-curve for the United States. We also have data from some other countries. And one of those countries is the Soviet Union. That's Russia. And I lay it on top of some of the other countries that we have data for because the U-curve starts earlier in the Soviet Union than anywhere else in the world. Why? Communist Revolution in 1917. And if you know anything about the Soviet Union, was it a society of high equality? Not really. Well, equality in some ways, everyone's equally miserable. Everyone is equally impoverished unless you're Joseph Stalin. Then you live in the palace. Or you're one of Stalin's friends and you get to live in the palace too until he decides to shoot you because you're a threat to his power. So measured inequality has to be distinguished from real inequality. This is measured inequality in the Soviet Union. It was very low on paper, but also very high in reality. So keep that in mind. These statistics don't tell a full picture even when we have good data, and we don't always have good data. You see in some other countries, most follow that same U.S. pattern that around 1945 to 1950, there's a trough and then there's a rebound. Here's another mess. I know it's a lot of data on there. I tried to lay on as many different countries as I could that we've got good data on it. That's the United States, France, Germany, South Africa, England, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. All of these have good data sources, and they seem to follow the U-curve around the same period. which is interesting. Some of these countries have wars fought in them, others do not. Yet war seems to be one of our main drivers. I do want to talk a little bit about Mexico and Latin America more broadly, because we do have some data, but we don't have income data for a lot of countries. Why? Records are poorly kept, especially going back in time. This is a problem in Mexico. It's a problem in a lot of Latin America. There are some attempts to try to reconstruct it and estimate it based on little bits and pieces of data, but none has come anywhere close to accuracy yet. What we do know about Mexico and what we do know about Latin America is we can get another measure of the distribution. This is referred to in the economics literature as the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient, think of a scale of 0 to 1. 1 is high inequality, 0 is perfect equality. So anywhere you are on that scale in between tells you your relative position over time. So if the Gini coefficient is going down, society's getting more equal. If it's going up, society's getting less equal. So it doesn't tell you the income level, but it tells you a relative position. So that's a little easier to calculate, and the data's better on that. This is a study put out by the World Bank in 2017 where they looked at across all of Latin America, and they found something really interesting. Since about 2000, maybe 2002, 2003, they look at Gini coefficients up until the most recent year they've done in their release, which is 2012. All this data lags behind by 5, 6, 7 years. In every country except for one, and that's Honduras, the Gini coefficient is going down, which is really interesting. And some of it's going down in pretty pronounced ways. All of Central America plus Mexico is this dark red line right there. So we start at close to 0.55, now we're closer to 0.50. That's a pretty big move in Gini coefficients. And you see it in the individual countries. It's all transitioning downward. I'd say that's probably a good sign. There's a zoomed-in version of Mexico going back to 1990, which is the first year that the World Bank reports data on. And we see it was well above 0.50. It was at about 0.56, I think, at the peak. And now it's dropped down to about 0.50. So over the past 30 years, over our lifetimes, inequality has gotten better. But this is a relative position in inequality. We don't know what it means from income because we don't have the good data on that. But it's kind of interesting because this trend is moving opposite of what is claimed about the United States at the same time. This is really interesting. I first want to challenge the claim that income tax policy has much of anything to do with this, and I'm going to show you using data. This chart is something I put together from the World Development Indicators, which is put out by the World Bank, and the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is put out by the Fraser Institute. And what they did is they put on two axes, vertical axis is the top income tax rate, the highest rate that millionaires and billionaires pay. And then the horizontal axis is the latest year's available data for what the top 10% of income earners have. So we only have 1 year. Most year it's 2015, but in some countries you have to go a little bit earlier because that's the last time they reported it. And if Piketty's theory held up, you'd expect countries with higher income tax rates to have lower inequality, and countries with low income tax to have higher inequality, right? That's the intuition here. What do we have instead? A giant blob of data in the middle. There might be a little bit of a relationship you could draw out of that. You could probably fit a line, but it would not be a good line, not a clean line. It's not something that is robust in the social sciences. In other words, that's the correlation coefficient that comes out of there. That's a really low, weak correlation. What it means is that countries that have high income tax rates are not really showing much of a difference from countries that have low income tax rates. It's just a random cluster of data, or it might as well be. So that undermines some of our theory here that income taxes are the reason that inequality is going up and down. I do want to give an alternative historical account. And that account's going to start with some of the same events. The Great Depression in 1929 and World War II in particular, 1939 to 1945. These are major events in world history. They're major events in U.S. economic history. And they alter the income distributions quite a bit. First, 1929, the Great Depression. Stock market collapses. Who gets hurt the most? Those who own stocks, right? They lose their fortunes. There are stories of people in New York City jumping out of windows on Wall Street because they were ruined. They faced devastation. It's actually a much slower process that plays out across the country because there's an initial stock shock in 1929, but it really draws out over the next 3 to 4 years. To 1933, a continuous contraction in the U.S. economy, and then the world economy follows. One of the reasons it follows, the United States does something really stupid in the middle of the Great Depression. They cut off trade with the rest of the world. They impose tariffs, taxes on trade with the rest of the world. And this triggers everyone else to do what? To retaliate. So the United States says, we're going to cut off trade with the rest of the world by taxing your goods. What does England say in return? Oh yeah, we'll tax you. What does France say? We'll tax you. Whole rest of the world starts to follow suit. And over the course of just 4 years, global trade is decimated. It's cut from a height in 1929 to a low in 1934 that was less than a quarter of the total volume. Just overnight as a result of this. So that's going to cause an economic collapse that spreads across the global economy. There are other issues in play. There's monetary issues through the way that the U.S. government mismanaged its monetary system. It constrained its money supply at a time when there were pressures that needed to go in the other direction. And this filters into other countries as well. A lot of bad policy mistakes happened in the Great Depression. Long story short is it really hurts wealth, especially at the top. The capital stock diminishes, and it diminishes fairly rapidly. World War II happens right on the heel of that. If you're in Europe, if you're in the Pacific Islands, if you're in Japan, if you're in China, the war is in your backyard. Your cities are being bombed. Your houses and farms are being destroyed. That is the physical destruction of capital. So the Depression was the economic destruction. World War II is the physical destruction in those countries. Except one place in the world. That's the North and South American continents. We do not have war on our continent. And we're better off for it. We emerge in a better position because our cities are not bombed. Many neutral countries throughout the war, and then those that are involved in it, United States and Canada in particular, are fighting abroad. So they're sending their troops abroad. That means that the war is not fought there, capital is not destroyed. Which is interesting because that moves in the other direction of what the European story should tell. So I want to show some problems with the Piketty narrative. Starting with the U.S., and this relates to the way that income inequality is measured in the U.S. We have problems in our data. And that data is displayed in that giant Ucurve that I showed. One of the projects that I do, one of the things I undertake on a daily basis, is a continuous revision of income distribution statistics for the United States. And this goes all the way back to 1913 and carries forward to the present. And what I end up doing is going line by line over 100 years of data to find if all the records line up. And it turns out that they do not. It turns out that if you go back historically, there are all sorts of errors and problems in the way that tax records are collected. It's really boring stuff. I'll spare you the details, But any of you that have done economic research, you know this well, because you go line by line and figure out how much people reported on their taxes and see if this matches up with official records. You've got to compare data over time. Some fun things that I discovered in the United States historically. If you worked for the state government, you were a public employee, prior to 1939, you did not have to pay income taxes. It's pretty good if you're a teacher, a firefighter, policeman, work in the mayor's office. You did not have to pay income taxes. Why? There was a weird oddity in the law that caused a disagreement between the state governments in Washington, D.C., and as a result, they were not able to tax income. They didn't resolve that until 1939. Now imagine trying to measure income data prior to 1939, but you're missing the public sector. Do you have accurate statistics? No. You're missing maybe 25% of your workforce in some years. That's just not recorded in income tax statistics. So I had to fix that. I had to find out where that income data was and estimate it from another source. It's one thing I have to do. Other fun ones that come up. During the mid-20th century, the United States enacts a law that allows soldiers that are fighting a war abroad to exempt the income that they earn as soldiers. So I have to correct for that. Third one, Alaska and Hawaii. They were the most recent additions to the United States. They used to be territories. They didn't join the United States as states until 1959. Turned out, if you looked at the historical statistics, Piketty and some of the others that had estimated before that were unaware of this. So they were missing Alaska and Hawaii's income. I had to bring that in. More recent stuff, there were changes in the tax code on what you could exempt and deduct. So from about 1954 to the 1980s, if you were a real estate investor, you could take a cruise to the Hawaiian Islands or a cruise across the world and attend a real estate seminar on board the cruise and deduct $10,000 off of your taxes, your travel expenses, for a 1-hour real estate seminar. This is a loophole. It was written into the tax code. They corrected that in 1986 and fixed it. I corrected it for what it did to all of the data prior to that. Lots of errors, lots of things that have to be brought into account. And this explains why the U.S. looks like it has a more pronounced swing than all these other countries, even though there was no war fought there. Timing doesn't necessarily coincide. The two key years of the turn are 1943 and 1986, so World War II and then the rebound. But it turns out those are also the years that they changed the tax code in the U.S. And if you adjust for those changes, most of the effect goes away. And then finally, the big one, there's no accounting for immigration in U.S. data. And what do we know about immigration? It's changed quite a bit over the last century. So I'm going to tell you the immigration story. All of those things I just walked you through, plus dozens of other smaller things that had to be fixed about the U.S. tax code, cause a revision to the U-curve. So the blue line is the original U-curve, and I use the top 10% here so we can zoom in a little closer. It's a little more fine-grained, but it's basically the same pattern. Blue line is the original U-curve. All these red lines are my models and two other models from economists at the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C., that have revised and edited and fixed all these issues, fixed all the corrections. And what you find out is if you adjust for all the corrections that I walked through, it lowers the curve across the board. It flattens it out. And there are two versions of the model since the 60s to the present. One's like the more liberal version, the other's the more conservative version. But it's there to show you the spread of everything. This is all the adjustments in cumulative, and then recently we brought it together in a common series. So the old series is blue, the new series is red. New data that I'm about to release probably within the next month or so. So y'all are some of the first that get to see it. This may be on the news because all the news uses the blue series. we'll have a new red series. What do you notice about the red series in concentration? Does inequality change over time? Yes. Does it change as much? No. It's a lot flatter. We've moved from what I call the U-curve to the T-saucer. It's a very slight dip, and then it comes back up. So this is probably the most pertinent data exercise I do right now compared to the United States presidential campaigns, because all of them are basing their policies on the blue curve. And I'd argue if we adopt the red curve instead, we get very different results. That's the fun of the measurement. There's some other economists that have attempted to extend this to wealth. So the last one's income. We move to wealth, and we see the same effects. So the red is the original line. Very pronounced U-curve. All of these others, and it's kind of cluttered there. I do that intentionally to show you the different models. All of these others are attempts to estimate the same thing different ways and improve some of the data based on some errors that we think are underlying the red curve. A few of the fun ones, and really one of the issue. When you add up net worth, you ask people how much they own, ask them to estimate their wealth. How do you do that accurately? Any guesses? How would you accurately measure net worth? Well, one, you could ask rich people. You say, Jeff Bezos, Carlos Slim, Bill Gates, how much do you own? Tell me how much you're worth. And what do they answer? Probably, I don't know. I don't know. And they'll say, well, what if we help you? Let's add up all your stock. How much is your stock worth? And I say, okay, I can get a figure for that. And then let's add up all your houses. How much are they worth? What's your bank account say? And you can start to get at it. But it's a lot harder than it looks like on paper. Because if you own a whole bunch of stock, say you're Mark Zuckerberg, you own all of this Facebook stock, you have a controlling share in the company, and tomorrow you decided to sell all your Facebook stock at its trading price, what would happen to Facebook stock? Collapse. Because the biggest shareholder has just liquidated all of his assets. So we can estimate the current value of Facebook stock at its current price, but if he tries to sell at that current price is no longer valid. It changes. So there's the problem with estimating wealth. That's a conceptual issue. Second problem with it, this is true anywhere. If you ask billionaires, some billionaires lie. This was discovered in 1990, that billionaires lying is a big problem. It's discovered in 1990 when Forbes magazine was calculating the Forbes 400 list of the richest people in the world. And they asked one man to estimate his net worth. And this man was a real estate developer in New York City. Some of you may know where I'm going with this. Donald Trump. They asked Donald Trump, how much are you worth? And he said, billions and billions of dollars. And he gave him this outrageous figure. And they started checking against the real estate records of the buildings he owned. And they found, Forbes found, that the buildings were actually priced at about half of what he told them. So he lied. He overstated his net worth. They began referring to this as the Donald Trump problem. Why? Because he wanted status. He wanted to be higher ranked on the list. So we don't know the outcome of what his actual net worth was. It got so bad at one point, he even made up a fake character and he called the reporter from Forbes magazine and said, I am John Barron, I work for Mr. Trump, and you're treating him unfairly. You are giving the wrong prices for his buildings. He's worth twice as much as what you estimate. And it's clearly Donald Trump's voice. They still have these recordings. You can find them on the internet. They're great. Look, John Barron, Donald Trump recordings, Forbes magazine, 1990. What does this mean for measurement? Well, it gets really hard to differentiate all the different approaches to estimating net worth, even if you had good statistics, and we don't. So what has the Federal Reserve tried to do with this? Well, they've tried to statistically sample independently And their best line of what they've come up with recently is this red line. They only have data going back to 1989, so we don't really know what happened before then. And especially in the early part of the century, this is probably a little haywire. It's based on some really fuzzy data. But we do know from 1989 to the present, the Federal Reserve now has a better measurement of wealth inequality in the United States. And you find out it's only growing at about half the rate of what we previously thought in this older series. So if we were correcting wealth inequality in the United States, I'd say ignore that first bit and pay attention to the Federal Reserve's new data. And something really interesting happens. If we start in 1945 and look to the present, there's still a U-curve, but it's a very, very slight U-curve. We're basically in 1945 and today in the United States at about the same level, hovering right around 30% wealth share, according to the best data that we have. In other words, it hasn't changed all that much. It went down a little bit, and then it came back a little bit. It could get worse. We don't know yet, but we want to study. And I want to ask you to consider an alternative reason of why this may have changed. So pay attention to those 2 years. We're still hovering at 30%. Timing matters. Timing matters because the century-long pattern, if it looks like a tea saucer, it doesn't fit the narrative that income taxes are the reason that wealth is going up and down, or that income is going up and down. If anything, we see a lot of similarities between the 1950s and today in the wealth statistics, a little less so in the income statistics, but there's another reason for that. What can we get out of the data? One story I want to tell you is about immigration. And this pertains to quite a bit of U.S.-Latin American relations because it's been a policy issue for the past 60 or 70 years in very pronounced ways. And why do I tell you a story of immigration? I've got two pictures up here. One of them's personal. The other was a humorous event that I think happened about a week ago with the border wall. This is an old picture that I have. My dad actually has. That is my great-grandfather's immigration card when he moved to the United States in 1916. And we have this immigration card because the U.S. government made him register for the draft for World War I. So we have a record of everything that happened. And I use this story because it pertains to why people immigrate. Why do they move from any country? And this is true of all of human history. The economics of immigration give us an answer. It's normally to find higher wages, to find a better job. Sometimes you move for family, sometimes you move for all sorts of different reasons, but the biggest economic reason is to find higher wages. And what you have, if you have different countries that have labor markets that there's a gap between the labor markets, where one is paying a lot higher and is starved for labor, there's a lower supply of labor, the natural tendency will be people move there to take advantage of that opportunity to get the job because it pays more. That's the lure. That's what my great-grandfather did. That's what millions of people have done in the decades since. And it's true across the world. It's not only in North and South America. You see the same pattern happening in Asia, in Europe, in Africa. People migrate for jobs. But government doesn't always like people to migrate for jobs. Hence, they build walls and they put in regulations. Sometimes the wind comes and knocks the wall over, which is fun. We'll see how that holds up. But I'm sitting there laughing at this when I see it on TV, and then I come down here, and it's like, yay, the law fell. What does this do to inequality, though? So can we all agree that if people move for immigration reasons to get higher wages, that's good for them? Because they get better jobs. They get paid more. If you or I or anyone else moves to a new country, it could be a new city, it could be a new state. I immigrated internally in the United States from Georgia to Massachusetts 2 years ago. Why? Had a new and better paying job in Massachusetts. It's what people do. I'm better off because of it. My employer, I would like to think, is better off because of it, because they're paying me to stay there. And this is true of anyone that migrates and moves, whether it's internally or across a border, it's in pursuit of wages. But the paradox of it, the interesting thing, is while labor migrates from lower to higher wage areas to take advantage of those opportunities, that's the basic economics, it's welfare enhancing, it's good for the person that migrates, and presumably good for the person that's paying them, because now they have people to work. But the paradox is, it changes the inequality statistics. If migrants are coming from a lower income area to a higher income area, that means by definition they're going to be at the bottom distribution of society. They may be in the bottom 20% or 30% or 50%. They're not going to be the top 1%. They move to an area from low income to high income. That by definition will increase inequality, right? Even though the migrant's better off, measured inequality increases. There have been some studies for the U.S. One in 2009 estimated that over the past, I think it was 30 to 40 years, about 5% of U.S. inequality rise in that same period was accounted for strictly by migration into the United States. And this is going to fit our timeline. But one of the other implications is measured inequality, if it's rising, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. If low-income people are moving into a higher income area, it's good for them, it's good for the area, but it means inequality is going to rise. So it could be a sign you have to differentiate the two. And in fact, we see points of this in U.S. history that I'd like to point out for the world. 1924 was the year that the United States closed down its borders to migration from a lot of the world. We call it a xenophobic moment. They adopted an immigration act that strictly cut off the influx of people. Notice what period it's in, both on the old and the new measures of the income distribution. It's a period of high and rising inequality. Inequality declined over the next 3 to 4 decades until 1964. What happened in 1964? The United States relaxed its immigration laws. It expanded its immigration laws. Didn't fully eliminate them, but it broadened them. They changed course. And what happened after 1964 in both the old and the new data? Income inequality increases. Over the same period, we see the actual numbers into the United States as a percentage of the U.S. population and as a raw number. So blue line is the number of immigrants total. It increased through the 1920s, flattened out, decreased through the 1960s, and has risen. So you see the two policies there. This is as a percentage of the population. First-generation immigrants as a percentage of the population. Through about the 1920s, so my great-grandfather came over right around there. 1924 cuts it off, and as a percentage of the population, immigration tanks to 1964, then it's on the rebound ever since. Not saying that immigration policy today is perfect, but we see it changing course. We see the overall trajectory change. And this has had profound effects on migration and profound effects on income. Immigration restrictions, we find, are often regressive. That means that they hurt the lowest income people the most. In other words, the people that are most likely to move. And this is true across the world. Everywhere it's stated. The United States has a lot of data on it, but we know in dozens of other countries that this is true. Another study put out by McLaughlin and Stanley, these are two economists that I've worked with a bit at George Mason University, they found that the number of steps you have to go through to apply to immigrate legally, the more that increases, the higher the Gini coefficient of the given country. And they studied something like 150 countries to come up with that data. And they found that the countries that have the most regulatory steps to immigrate have higher Gini coefficients. In other words, there's actually a penalty in inequality that comes about. And then the third thing is that when immigration increases, we do see an upward shift in the Gini coefficient. And this is some data from the United States from 1995 to the present. The red line is without immigrants included. The blue line is with immigrants included. So what this brings us together is that immigration is a big part of our inequality story. And it's a big part of our inequality story in generally a good way. As immigration has increased, inequality has also increased, but life has gotten better for people who have migrated. And that actually coincides with almost the exact period in Piketty and Saez's Ucurve, in some of our data, in some of our illustrations that we've gone through. And I do want to close on that point and then open it up to questions on anything that comes up in the data, just by noting that I think that if you examine some of these underlying issues, if you examine some of these other causes, alternative to what is presented in the news, we separate income inequality from tax policy and start to look at other causes, start to look at other issues. We find out that the tax policy is not as powerful of a tool as the politicians tell you it is. And there's a reason for this. If you are wealthy and the government passes a new tax, what do? How do you respond? You go abroad. You move to another country. Or if you have a really good accountant, what do? You move all your bank account from personal income into your company and still continue to live on it. And it's taxed at a lower rate. You find a shelter. And shelters exist all over the world. It's just a reality of life. They're really hard to enforce, really hard to rein in and bring under control. But if you have a good accountant, you can find one. And this is what we find whenever we use tax policy to try to change the income distribution. People will take some of their income off of paper and they'll put it in another country where it's not recorded at all, even though they're still getting it. And this is what happens at periods when tax rates are really high. When they cut the rates, what happens? All that income comes home. And now it's back on the records again. We saw this exact story in the United States in the period of the U-curve. At the bottom of the U-curve, very high tax rates, but everyone moved their income abroad or into undertaxed categories, corporate income, exemptions, deductions, loopholes. When they cut the tax rates and eliminated some of the loopholes, they brought it back in as above the board income. So that's why, and I'll go back to that chart really quick, the one that shows wealth from the 1950s to today, why it's only changed a little bit if you do a better estimate, as opposed to this giant sweeping U-curve. It's because people were shifting their taxes abroad or shifting their taxes into corporations. So I think the lesson that comes out of this is if you want to address inequality, stay away from tax policy that just causes people to evade and avoid taxes, and really focus on the social policy. And that is expanding opportunities for immigration and recognizing that that may in the short run, increase inequality, but it improves the lives of the people that are affected by it. Similar effect happens when you allowed more women to enter the workforce between the mid-20th century United States and today. When you eliminated segregation, more people entered the workforce from the mid-20th century United States and today. This improves lives. It changes the measurement of inequality, and it looks like an illusion, like it's rising at the first, but in the long run, you end up better off. In the long run, you get that downward trajectory eventually of what stabilizes in the Gini coefficient. So I'll conclude on that. Be happy to take any questions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Phil. This is a recorded conference, so we're going to ask everybody who has a question, just please wait for the microphone and speak into it. I'll be ready and happy to give it to you.
Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for the conference. About the timing matters,
Mhm.
we saw that immigration is a big factor for the wealth.
Yeah, I can go.
Do you think we to work with that? We should like work on the problems about immigration, like try to have better laws that
Absolutely.
could support that, or because we saw that if you close it, well,
Inequality goes down.
yeah, inequality
Right.
goes down. But the immigration helps a lot for the net worth.
Yeah.
So the what should be the best thing to work with it, with the immigration thing?
Yeah, so specific to the U.S. policy, I'm going to say that our immigration system's a mess. It is an absolute mess. It's a bureaucratic nightmare, both legal and illegal. We all know this. We've all seen it firsthand on the news. But it takes months, if not years, to go through the process, even legally. That increases the cost of the process. That inhibits migration across borders. I would very much favor a streamlining and improvement of the efficiency of that process, as well as expanding the number of opportunities for people to cross the border and do so legally. I think that would show up on the numbers in the short run as an increase in inequality, but on the long run, an increase in overall wealth. So that seems to be the pattern in most countries that have tried it. We have some historical examples. You can go back 50 years, 100 years ago and find other countries where there were mass migrations. And initially, the migration brings in lower income people that are nonetheless better off. And then within 1 or 2 generations, those people have moved into the upper middle class or have become wealthy themselves. So I think if our goal is to have a wealthy society, not just an equal society, but a wealthy society, we want more immigration.
Thank you. Well, my question regards the next slide. I think so.
See,
Because
this one?
no, yes.
That one. Okay.
The number of steps to enter into business increases the Genie coefficient.
Yeah.
You mean the regulations to actually come into the country?
Exactly.
For immigrants?
So to get a visa or to start up a company, and that's the measurements that they come up.
So, my question is, doesn't that contradict the following statement? Because, or does the following statement refer exclusively to the United States?
Right. So the Gini coefficient is going. So this is a number. This is a database of several hundred countries. So they're doing an overall trend, and then this is only the United States is what's being shown in that study.
And so, doesn't it contradict?
So if we have an overall measurement of trends internationally, you are summarizing dozens, if not hundreds, of countries. There are specific conditions to the United States that are shown. What we see is immigration, as it increases, it does shift the Gini coefficient upward, specific to the United States, but that's other factors that are probably counteracting the overall trend of policy. I think what you'd see in the business index, if you looked at the steps across other countries that don't have a huge demand for immigration at the moment, which is what the United States is kind of an outlier in that sense. So if that makes sense, the U.S. is a very exceptional country in that regard compared to others.
In your experience, do any other nations will share the same specific characteristics the United States do? For example, maybe Japan, maybe.
Yeah. It's there's not many that are exactly like the United States, of being both a very large economy with a high demand for immigration. We are starting to see a little bit the European Union as a whole. If you measure everyone that's in the European Union, and there's a migration crisis, but it's a different type of crisis. It's mostly people coming out of war zones in the Middle East that have tried to migrate into the European Union. So a little bit of a different dynamic, but they also find we're starting to see countries individually push back against that, so you get populism and they raise barriers.
And my final question
Uh-huh.
regarding immigration, do you see the increase, the increasing incursion of robots in the productive chain,
Right.
like
So technology.
yeah, technology, a transcendent factor that may shift the need for more immigrants to change the workforce.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing of all technology in human history. That's a really important question. We think now, looking forward, are robots going to take over the economy? And maybe that sounds science fiction-y. There's some truth to increasing productivity using automation, mechanization. I'm not as worried about it as some are. If you go back and look at the historical examples, people were saying the same thing by the introduction of trade in the 1840s, which was the big year that they started to expand trade globally. That's when England, which was the biggest economy in the world, cut its tariffs. Everyone thought that, it's going to put everyone out of work because goods are going to be coming in from abroad, and now we have ships carrying them. There were some claims about automation when the factories started to emerge in the late 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we had mass movement toward factories. Everyone thought, this is going to put people out of jobs because everything's mechanized. What it ends up doing is there's temporary displacements. There's short-term displacements of people that were previously farmers that now are working in a different sector. People that were previously in a trade job that are now doing a professional job. Blacksmiths. How many blacksmiths are there in the world today? Not many. Not many. But it used to be one of the biggest skilled trades. Sitting there with a hammer, you bang on the metal to make it into a shape. Make it into a tool. Now it's all automated. It destroyed the blacksmithing industry, but no one really predicted what was going to come next. And people that were previously blacksmiths and their children and their grandchildren are now in other industries. So we don't know exactly what the robot automation is going to yield. I'm a little less worried than the politicians are for the specific reason that unseen opportunities tend to move and emerge very quickly.
I would like to ask, what is your opinion on Milton Friedman?
Milton Friedman.
It seems you have very similar opinions
Yeah.
on many topics.
Yeah.
And like on the previous question, like what is your opinion on the idea that's becoming more popular of universal basic income?
Right.
And going on with that, Milton Friedman came up with the idea he called the negative income tax.
Exactly.
I believe that is a much better solution to universal basic income, and perhaps you could explain UBI,
Sure,
the negative income tax, for the people who are not aware
Absolutely.
of what they are.
This is a great question. So Milton Friedman started as an economist. He started working in 1939 on the subject of inequality. He never returned to it really, other than like talking about it in the background. He moved into monetary issues. But Milton Friedman, does everyone know who Milton Friedman is? 20th century economist, won the Nobel Prize, associated with free market thought. And I'd say I share a tradition with him. He was from the University of Chicago. I'm from George Mason University. So overlapping traditions, but we're different schools of thought, but in the same universe. And what Milton Friedman did with this idea, he proposed in the 1960s the concept of a negative income tax. And what it basically is there's a rebate for people at the bottom of the distribution in their taxes. And that rebate's basically a payment or a credit that they get every year, and it absolves them of a tax burden, and in some cases it actually gives them more money on a recurring basis, but it's tied to their income tax. It's automatic in the system. And the idea behind it is you make the tax system less burdensome on the poor and even a benefit on the poor. And it ratchets up in its scale depending on where you are in the income ladder and incentivizes movements into higher income brackets is the idea. The interesting thing about the negative income tax, we basically have that in the United States. There's an earned income tax credit and a child tax credit that are built into the income tax system, and they have an effect of basically reducing any regressive imposition on the poor. It's important to this debate because Piketty and Sayez and Zuckman, the guys that authored the blue income distribution curve, I should note this is an important thing to note. This is all pre-tax income. It doesn't include any benefits. It doesn't include the tax credits that are basically Milton Friedman's idea of the earned income tax credit. When you bring those in, the distribution levels out even further. The distribution doesn't change as much. In other words, the earned income tax credit is working. It's working pretty well. There's been a big data controversy because these guys released some tax numbers that excluded the earned income tax credit in the United States, and they got into some trouble, both from economists on the political right and the political left. So conservatives and then even some advisors to President Obama criticized them because they had omitted this data. They had left out an important fact. The idea of taking the negative income tax or a tax credit system versus universal basic income, everyone knows what UBI is. This is the idea that the government pays an annual income to every person, no matter where you are on the ladder, of like $1,000 a year or $5,000 a year, wherever they set it at. And they do this in the place of welfare. They do this in the place of a safety net. And there's a few candidates that have campaigned on it. It's an interesting idea. I think it's an improvement over a badly structured welfare system. But I think it's a worse idea than a functioning welfare system, a functioning safety net. The reason being political implementation. You start giving people with no questions asked $5,000, what do? They ask for $6,000 next year. And what if you proposed a swap with that? You say, I'm going to give you a universal basic income of $5,000 every year, and in exchange, we're going to get rid of health care, we're going to get rid of Social Security, safety nets, pensions, old age pensions, everything else. Do you think most people would make that deal? No. They'd want both of them. They say, give me $5,000 and keep all the old pensions, and then you end up bankrupting the system. So it's fiscally unsupportable, whereas I think Friedman's idea is more functional in the tax system. So I know that was a long answer. That answer...
Yeah, it's very well. Now, this might be a bit of a complicated question, but this is a bit more political than economic.
Okay.
But I know a lot of people who believe the phrase, every country has the government it deserves.
Right.
And
right.
I've struggled to think if I actually agree or disagree with that phrase, because I think some people deserve a better government.
Yes.
So what is your opinion on that quote?
Absolutely. So every people deserve have the government they deserve. It's scary to me right now because that means I deserve Donald Trump. So I don't know about that. I think so. My opinion on that is I think every human being deserves a functional government, a society that's not robbing them, a society that's providing services for them that are not riddled in corruption. This is an area of economics that I work in. It's referred to as public choice economics. And a public choice problem is an area where a government official has decided to get rich off of the public treasury or off of manipulating the rules of the game to give them something that's called an economic rent. And an economic rent is basically graft. It's stealing. It's stealing from the public. It's stealing through manipulating the laws to make it harder for your competitor to do business. And all the money goes to you as a return. I think this is a pervasive feature of politics. It's obviously worse in some countries than others. The ideal is that you want to limit rent extraction. You want to limit corruption. You want to limit graft. And sometimes that means taking away the power of the politicians to give out favors to their friends. Sometimes that means curtailing what they can even do, period, with the Constitution, with a rule that says, no, you are not allowed to give favoritism to this business because he's your cousin and your uncle. You are not allowed to use public treasury money for a personal enriching project. So reforms of that So some of the best arguments philosophically, this is political philosophy, say that if we have a uniform rule, they sometimes refer to as a generality norm in the literature. A generality norm says that no politician can be treated any differently than anyone else, and no non-politician can be treated any differently than anyone else. The law cannot be used to discriminate positively or negatively in favor of anyone. We all have to live by the same rules. That's a way to limit corruption and graft. Yes?
What recommendations would you give for tax policy, for example, in our country, in Mexico?
Yes, yes.
Because I know, for example, the tax policy here is more dedicated to raise money
Yes.
from what would you call sanctioning people for
Yeah.
doing stuff wrong,
Yeah.
instead of perhaps implementing a tax policy to benefit people. Like, what recommendations would you give to our country to be able to implement that?
Right. So Mexico, as I understand, has a very high value-added tax and a very high sales tax on top of it, just across the board. The problem with that, it directly penalizes economic activity. Because every time you purchase something, you are paying the tax. Every time you do business with someone else, you are paying the tax or they're paying the tax. The incidence is put entirely on the participants of the transaction, the consumer and the seller. So a tax system that's basically generating money in that way is by necessity diminishing the economic value of the transaction. It's coming from the people that are participating in it. I don't know the perfect fix of what would make a revenue neutral tax system. I do tend to favor across the board low and uniform taxes. So a tax cut in general, and I know everyone will say that's popular. I like to pay lower taxes. You like to pay lower taxes in general. But having uniformity and low levels of taxation tends to be better for prediction of future transactions. If you are a businessman, you are a consumer, you know that you're going to have a lower tax rate that makes it easier to engage in that transaction. So no easy fix, unfortunately. What you find in most tax policy, and this is true of any country in the world, when you have an existing system, there are people that are vested in keeping that system the way that they have it now. Why? Because they're getting money out of it. If you're the mayor, you're the governor, you're the president, and your tax system is bringing in the revenue that you like right now, you have no incentive to change it. That's across the board. So it's a really tricky area of policy. But in an ideal world, I say go back to Adam Smith. He wrote a great system of principles of taxation in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, and he lists out step by step what a just tax system looks like and an unjust tax system. So don't have time to go through each and every one of these principles, but his notion is low, uniform, and don't penalize economic transactions. It does. So property taxes are tricky. Historically, when property taxes were invented and first created, the idea was if you owned a farm and you had a really good crop year, your property tax is higher. You had a bad crop year, your property tax is lower. We don't have that as much anymore because real estate has shifted toward houses and buildings and businesses. So it's a little bit of a relic of a system, and unfortunately that makes it somewhat regressive. It hurts the lower income more than it does the top, because if you're rich, you can afford a multi-million-dollar mansion and the taxes on it. Unfortunately, we see some states in the U.S. have a property tax crisis at the moment because they haven't adjusted their systems from years ago.
Who's got a question? Anyone go on?
All right.
Thank you for your presentation. I think we all enjoyed what you just said. And the data on inequality is based on the differences between the top earners versus the bottom of the bottom income population. But what about the data that compares the income differences between those who have higher degrees of education versus
Yes.
lower degrees of education, and what's your opinion and policy recommendations on that
Yes.
matter?
So I've given this talk several times on what to major in college. And I know everyone's perking up thinking, what do you study in college? Because if you imagine your lifetime earnings, so how much from when you enter the workforce, and that could be at age 18, could be at 20, 21, 22, depends on how many years you spend in school, through when you retire at 60 or 70. What's your total earnings? How much money do you get over your career? Well, the best data we have on this say that people that finish with a college degree increase their total earnings, but they do so at different levels. If you study science, math, engineering, economics, business, social science, those tend to be the really high-end degrees, that they have a higher level of lifetime learning. And there's a study, it only uses U.S. universities, but it seems to hold in other countries as well. So people that study in the fields I just named get a really high-end lifetime improvement in their earnings versus those that don't go to college. But then on the other end of it, I say this even though I like some of these fields, but if you study painting, if you study drama and theater, poetry, even there's a degree in blacksmithing. I know I mentioned that. There's not many blacksmiths anymore, but you could get a degree in blacksmith. Those actually have a net negative over your career, or they're very close to break even. You don't get as much of a return on that. So the rule I'd say is a college degree in the right field vastly increases your lifetime potential earnings. A college degree in the wrong field puts you in debt. So, and you notice the United States has a huge student debt crisis right now, as does Canada, as do some of the European countries are a little bit better off because they don't charge as much in education. But tuition in most parts of the world is going up, and you have to consider that in your calculation. If you're going to pay tuition, you might as well pay it for something that gives you a good return. So major in things that get a good return.
Why do you think on both sides of the political aisle, politicians are using free trade as an excuse for the problems of the society?
Oh, that's frustrating. It's an easy scapegoat. So everyone heard that the question is why is free trade blamed for the problems of society? It's because there are not many people that will advocate for free trade as their personal interest, even though it affects all of us. What does free trade do economically? And we know this from the data, we know it from the theory, we know across the board. Free trade means more stuff at cheaper prices for all of us. It's welfare enhancing. If you restrict trade, it benefits a very few, but it harms everyone. Think of it this way. Let's say there are tariffs put in on steel manufacturing, which is what the U.S. has been really bad about doing. Who benefits from those tariffs? People that work in the steel industry. There may be a couple 100,000 of them. Who's harmed by those tariffs? Everybody. But the harm is spread very thin. The harm spreads so thin that you may pay a couple dollars more next year on an automobile. You may pay a few pennies more on a toaster, a refrigerator, a microwave, a set of spoons and knives and forks. Spread very, very thin. Is it worth your interest to go call your politician and say, my toaster cost more this year because you enacted a tariff? No. But if you work in the steel industry and say, whether I get a raise this year or whether my job is eliminated depends on you enacting a tariff, will you call your congressman? Yes. So what we have is there's a very disparate political system that people that are in industries that are benefit from restricting trade are really concentrated, whereas people that are harmed by the restriction of trade are really broad. And concentrated interests, paradoxically, have more effectiveness at changing laws because they're louder, they have a single cohesive interest, whereas all the rest of us, we're only taking a little bit of pain spread very thin across millions. So that's why trade is always beat up on.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have time for a couple more questions. Okay.
Can some tariffs be actually beneficial for an economy? For example, the farming industry of Switzerland, well, it only stays competitive because it imposes high taxes on foreign products.
Yeah.
Also, well, for some, for example, Ross Perot's giant sucking sound.
Yes.
Back in 1993, what he said about what the NAFTA would do to American jobs.
Yeah.
So how do you see the USMCA might have actually improved the conditions of the original NAFTA accords?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess the first question, can tariffs or the restriction of trade benefit a country? There's a vast empirical and theoretical literature on this subject. The empirical tests of it say that only in very rare, weird, exceptional circumstances could that be the case. And it's always something that is unusual, something related to how two countries interact with each other, or two or more countries interact with each other. The best data we have shows, and all the models, all the evidence from practice show that trade in general is necessarily welfare enhancing, because what does it do? Trade recovers a deadweight loss in the theoretical model that's excluded when you enact a tariff, when you enact a price manipulation. It allows it to be spread somewhere. It could be on the consumer side, could be on the producer side, but it goes somewhere into economic activity, and that increases overall welfare. So the best models say that trade is going to work. There are some weird circumstances, narrow cases when if you impose a tariff, you could potentially manipulate in this one narrow situation something in a direction. But the person that discovered these, so Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner and columnist, he's famous for discovering these models. He also writes a follow-up paper that says, don't do this, don't make a strategy based on this, because it'll be captured by the politicians and they'll misuse it. So that's the theoretical literature there. As far as NAFTA goes, if I were to reform NAFTA, if I were to fix it, and you know, we're still talking about this, I would make it simpler. My ideal would be cut the regulatory baggage that's built into the trade agreement. And I discovered this many decades ago. I worked briefly in the U.S. House of Representatives on the Trade Committee. And what I discovered, I arrived there as an economist and discovered the people that were really calling the shots were the lawyers. Shocker. That's what the lawyers do. But they were really, so they weren't just interested in my advice, but they were interested in negotiating a regulation that would say the intellectual property of this particular company is protected, or the environmental restrictions must be attached to this type of wood if you import it. And there are tens of thousands of pages of these things in every trade agreement. So what we get is the overall direction of trade agreements. They reduce barriers, but they do so with strings attached. I would say cut the strings and just allow trade to flow and move that to another domain of policy. Don't attach it as a condition of trade, because trade itself is just an exchange. Trade is no different than me walking across the street and buying a hamburger at the store. It's just we're doing it across an international border. And I don't need a regulation that says I must meet environmental conditions to cross the street. I shouldn't need it to cross the border.
Okay, last question, and I'm gonna abuse my power and ask it.
All right, all right.
So Phil, what would you think will be a likely scenario for the Mexican economy in the future, where a new American president raise the income taxes to the order of 60%,
Oh my
maybe
God.
80%?
Yes, yeah. So suppose Bernie Sanders got elected because he's campaigning on
Kind
that.
of bad.
Yeah, and Elizabeth Warren, there's a few others that are saying if they want 60 or 80% income taxes in the United States. If I were Mexico, I would say the government of Mexico should welcome U.S. investors, because as happens every time that tax rates are increased to that level, the people that would be subject to them look for opportunities abroad to put their money. And that means they're going to be moving to other countries. We saw this in France a few years ago. France enacted a wealth tax of this level in the late 2000s. What did everyone do? They moved to London, or they moved to Eastern Europe, or they moved to other countries. And all those other countries benefited. London got a huge influx of economic activity of people that were avoiding taxes in France. And it got so bad that France, after less than a decade, they repealed this tax. They said, no, we didn't mean to chase off all of our wealthy people. Bring your money back home and spend it in France. So if that happened in the United States, and I'm fearful, I hope that there's some restraint on it ever happening. That's my personal normative opinion. But if it did happen in the United States, I would urge other countries to open up their economies to activity that would certainly flow there to avoid the U.S. taxes. All right.
So please, let's give an applause to Phil.
Thank you.